Welcome, everyone, to the C-Suite Marketing Perspectives podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And today we've got a really interesting conversation about how the fear of missing out actually impacts revenue. And as B2B marketers, right, we're all very, very revenue minded these days. So this is going to be a conversation that you're going to want to take out the pen and paper and take some notes on, because we have on here, our special guest is Amanda Rabideau. And Amanda, you are a B2B marketing expert. You've been a fractional CMO at more than 24 different organizations. You have your own company, Arch Collective, that you've been doing since 2019. You worked for CoreLogic before that. You speak at industry events. So we're very happy to have you on today. And what I'd love to do is just maybe have you expand a little bit on that background and what you're doing, and then we'll jump into the FOMO revenue marketing. How about that?
Sure. Well, Steve, first, thank you for having me. It's always fun to dive deep into some of these marketing topics. You did a great job providing a background, and I did. I started Arch Collective back in 2019 after several years at CoreLogic. So while I do work with B2B tech companies across different industries, a lot of my clients tend to be in the insurtech or the property or real estate technology spaces. I'll have plenty of examples and can offer a lot of perspective on those industries, but excited to dive into the FOMO of revenue and some of my other favorite topics.
Well, then let's just start out with is kind of a foundation to, before we talk about FOMO and revenue marketing, what is your opinion on just what makes great marketing, right? And you've been in so many different organizations and helped create success so many different times over. I'd love just to start that way. What makes great marketing, B2B marketing?
Yep. And I always like to think that great marketing, there is a little bit in the audience that you're talking to, but in general, something that's relevant, so timely, and also, that captures someone's attention, right? We're living in a time where we are inundated with what we're getting on social media, what we see, or what we hear on podcasts, what we see on TV. So much content is out there. So things that are captivating and that can break through the noise, and that are relevant to what's going on in the world are usually the foundations of great marketing. And I would zoom out a little bit to also say that you have to keep the audience in mind. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about this with FOMO of revenue, but at the end of the day, I could come up with the most imaginative and creative and lovely idea that's all those things I said. But if it's not going to reach the audience you want to reach, then that's not great marketing.
And so this understanding, I think even Gartner was talking about the trend towards how CMOs today need to be more chief customer officers, right? We have to understand who it is. That relevance is all about understanding their needs, understanding their jobs, understanding what's impacting them, the risks through the decisions that they're making, all of that. So what in the idea of kind of the customer, and you have a perspective on representing the voice of the customer that I wanted to have you talk about a little bit.
Yeah. And I'm going to take us back about 20 years to the very first startup I
Okay.
ever worked at. I actually started off in customer success, moved into sales. And while I was and then I moved into marketing role after that. And what was really interesting, and I'm going to speak to my time in sales because it shaped how I think about marketing. When I was out there on the front lines and hearing what the customers were saying, I was getting very different information than when I moved into the marketing role and I was just sitting at my desk. And so everything I heard from my clients or potential clients too, when I was on sales calls, fed into what I talked about with the next customer, what I fed into what I gave to marketing to update the collateral that we had. And so now as a marketer, I find it that all marketers should do this, but it's something I certainly do and I think is a high value activity, but it's to set up and conduct voice of client interviews. And so this stems from that very first startup I ever worked at and the ability to listen to what they say and then translate that into the scripting or the collateral or the things that are relevant And in fact, I was, just speaking with an audience yesterday on this topic. And I said, look, so many times we overcomplicate things. If you conduct really valuable voice of client interviews, it's actually a somewhat like an easy way out of some of the hard work that marketers have to do. Well, what do I mean by that? If you ask the questions and you actually listen to what your clients are saying on the other side, they're going to tell you everything that you need to put out there in the market to help bring in top of funnel clients, to move them through, to keep clients, to make sure that they're renewing or potentially expanding. And so, one may say it's a lazy marketer's dream come true. It does take a lot of work, but like why not work smarter, as opposed to working harder? Conducting these voice of client interviews are really one of the most valuable and one of the most efficient things a marketer can do.
Well, one of the things that makes great marketing and marketing that produces fantastic ROI is where the voice of the customer actually leads the voice of the company itself, right? Because they're the
Yeah.
highest authority. Right? I mean, if we're ever making a decision, for the company, whether it's, in product development or it's in marketing or sales, if we always think of the customer as at that table, right? That's the voice of highest authority. And I know that you've talked about that many times over with your clients, right? That's so those customer interviews that you're talking about
Mhm.
powers you to be making decisions on behalf of those customers. And that trumps everything, right? Because I know you've worked with CEOs before, or your clients, where it's like, here's what we need to do. And sometimes those are exactly right. And the other times it's like, well, we need to consider this. And more often than not, we're representing the customer in that conversation. So I
Yep.
think that's a fantastic way to kind of think and frame this, right? Uh, so tell me
Agree.
a little bit more about, you know, the idea of FOMO in revenue marketing, because I think that's what we're all kind of leading up to in terms of, okay, fear of missing out, understand that. How do you think that plays into marketing, in particular revenue marketing? Maybe tell us like at the beginning, what you think of the difference between just great marketing and revenue marketing to start out with.
Yeah, well, I'm going to use the funnel to frame the conversation, right? And so, and I mentioned that I work with startup companies, and so often we talk about the TAM or the total addressable market. And the total addressable market shouldn't necessarily be your target audience, right? And so whenever I'm starting to work with a client, one of the first things I ask are who's your target audience? And no doubt I get the, oh yeah, we know exactly who it is. And then they list out like 5 to 10 different target audiences. And so when I talk about FOMO revenue, it's that niching down and really focusing on one, maybe two audiences if there's a lot of similarities, that especially for startup companies, it's so important to channel your efforts into focusing and niching down and not being worried about taking any and all revenue that come your way. So the next question might be like, well, why, Amanda? We're a startup. We need to bring in money. We need to demonstrate to our investors that we have product market fit. And the answer is exactly niching down and not having the FOMO of revenue or the fear of missing out on revenue is what is going to allow you to do that. And so the reason I want to take it back to the funnel is that if you have the whole addressable market that you're going after, and I'm going to make it real simple, and you say, okay, hey investors, we need $5 for marketing this year. And the five could be 500,000, 5 million, 5 billion, but we'll just say five for the sake of the conversation. Well, if your target audience is actually 5 different audiences, that means you got $1 for each audience. And those dollars those individual dollars are not going to get you very far because you're going to need different messaging. Going back to voice of client, you're going to have to conduct more voice of client interviews. So the idea is pick one of those audiences, and then you have $5 to spend to better understand that one audience. And so when you go out and you're pitching to your investors, hey, this is how we're going to continue to grow, you're going to know exactly what is my cost of acquiring that one type of audience? What are the channels I need to go to? What is the messaging? So when you niche down at the beginning, it's sort of like the proverbial go slow to go fast. You learn exactly what you need to do, and then you have the foundation for how you can accelerate and ramp up your business.
Yeah. It never makes sense to try to be everything to everybody. Right.
No.
And, so even in like, when your clients, I'm sure that they're talking about, oh, here's who our target audience is. Well, there's a broad definition, like a demographic definition of the target audience, but then there's also persona, right? And
Yep.
everything that you do, the more people you're trying to market to, the less effective you are going to be to the core, right? And that's when you're talking about this, it's like, what's the core audience? Who are the people that are going to fall in love with this, right?
Mhm.
And how do we bring those people on as our early advocates, right? Especially in a startup environment. Um, I have the similar background with being a fractional CMO for a lot of startup companies, and I started my own company as well. And it's very easy to fall into kind of oh, here's our tech, right? And here's, as soon as anybody finds out about this, they're just going to fall in love with it. The floodgates are going to open, right? And it just doesn't work that way, right?
Certainly not today. It doesn't. No.
No, no. And especially where there's so many choices and there's so many decisions to be made, right? What's interesting is I think a lot of people are probably thinking about FOMO marketing in terms of like the actual marketing that we're creating for the customer. And what you're talking about is the fear of missing out is actually creating much more of a generic go-to-market strategy, right? That isn't going to be
Yep.
as effective.
It certainly can. And then, it affects not only the go to market strategy, but on the back end, how you service those clients. Because hypothetically, if you're niching down by geography, what if you need a field team? Well, if you're saying, look, we're going to go to all of the US or all of the world, that may mean that you have different languages that you need to hire customer service reps for, or you need to be working different hours and you need to have teams that cover different time zones. And so it's not just on the marketing side, but then how you fulfill on whatever product or offering you have. And where that does tie back to marketing is that how do you then take that story to market to those different, in this case, geographies? Because as much as you want your marketing to bring you in the right people, you also want it to help you not bring in the wrong, or to not have you bring in the wrong people. Because if you bring in the wrong people, that usually ends up costing your business more, and it dilutes your brand, and you may end up having worse brand perception. Because if someone who, if let's say an 80-year-old woman buys shoes for a 13-year-old boy, maybe it's a silly example, they're not going to like the shoes, or vice versa. They're not going to like the shoes. And then they're going to talk poorly about the shoes and your brand. And then you've lost some brand equity, and you're not helping your business, and you're making things more challenging from a marketing perspective. So I get that that was a bit of a silly example, but it's like making sure that you focus on the right audience helps with marketing, but it also helps, all the way through the funnel. And even when it's, you're working on, renewing a customer or reselling or having a good customer experience.
Yeah, because, what you're talking about, bringing the wrong people in, there's been a lot that's been written about the death of the MQL, right? And
Right.
there's plenty of B2B organizations now that don't even track MQLs, right? Because, entry with a name and an email address for a download does not mean that they're ready for a serious conversation. And what it can do is just flood the sales team with a bunch of wasted time. Then that creates this tension that's already naturally there in the sales and kind of the marketing, the alignment that needs to happen. So it really, by going after everyone, you're almost guaranteed that you're going to be getting a ton of the leads that you do get aren't going to be good, and they're going to waste time. They're going to be inefficient. And then that product market fit that you're talking about, it's going to be that much harder to attain. Your cost of acquisition for leads is going to be harder to attain. It's going to be harder to attain more money in the next round as well, right?
I think you
So,
said it well. Yeah.
yeah, it really impacts the whole thing. So tell me a little bit about, this fear of missing out. There's a mentality, and it's one of the biggest things that in kind of this alignment between sales and marketing,
Hmm.
that sales typically has a very short-term focus, right? And it's understandable, right? You got a quota over your head. right? And your performance and your compensation is based on that. Where a lot of salespeople can kind of look over marketing and go, "You got your nice salaried position, right? As long as we keep the wheels going here, you can play." And you're like, "We're on the feast and famine, here."
Yep.
So, in terms of the alignment, right, and how do you work with and help support the sales effort, right? Because they should want more, not to try to sell to everybody, but they should want a focused message, focused enablement materials, focused case studies, stories that they can tell, that they can
Mhm.
use in the process. So how does that conversation work at this fear of missing out, not only at the C-suite, but in other departments inside where you're in as a fractional CMO, right?
Mhm.
And leading that charge.
Well, first and foremost, I mentioned that a lot of my marketing approach is impacted by that first sales job I had at a startup. And so I love working closely with sales, and think it's something that every CMO should do. There has been historically a lot of natural tension between the two. And I think where you're going with it is we tend to, or we've had in the past, conflicting incentives. So maybe what we're measuring or how successful marketing is measured is different than what successful sales, what they're measuring in their KPIs. And one small example that we had at a client was, unbeknownst to us, the sales leader was beginning to measure the time to conversion between getting the lead and close. And then on the flip side, we were measuring like, okay, are we actually bringing in leads aligned to the right ICP? But the time to close was a lot shorter with the wrong ICP. So they're like, hey, we want more of these leads, these are wrong. And we're like, wait, this isn't, like, we're not on the same page. And so it can happen to the best of us. But then it's a matter of, okay, let's everyone get together, the CEO, the chief revenue officer, the CMO, and let's just make sure we're all rowing in the same direction. Because sometimes it's just as a matter of, we didn't realize that if we're measuring this or we're incentivizing this KPI, it could be in conflict with what another function is doing. And this isn't just between sales and marketing, but everywhere, right? But it does happen with sales and marketing. And so those conversations, and whenever I start working with a client, I don't start with, what do you want for marketing? Because in some ways, I think my role is to help them determine, this is how marketing can best support you. I start with, what are your business goals? Like, we're coming up on a new year. Where is it that you want to leave? Where do you want to be at the end of 2024 that it will be successful? What are your revenue targets, your retention targets, all of that? And then we can audit, where are we today? What are the gaps? What's going to make the most impact on where we are today versus hitting those in this case, end of 2024 goals? And so where FOMO of revenue comes in, it's to say, okay, if this is where you want to go, like, is it having 5 audiences? Is it having one? Like, we can kind of shape that conversation around the end state goal rather than just trying to talk about, oh no, you got to narrow down your audiences, or just approaching it from the marketing lens. Because ultimately, marketing should be playing well in the sandbox with multiple functions across the company. And so making sure that whatever we're doing aligned to the business goals, that's the most important thing. We shouldn't be aligned to just, what are these marketing goals. They should roll up to the corporate goals.
Well, that means everybody has the same plan, right? If you're aligning to the same,
Easier said than done. It happens a lot less than you would like to think.
I know, I do. So, a lot of what marketing's function is the development of content that goes into the demand gen campaigns, content
Yep.
that goes into sales enablement, content that's on a thought leadership basis that establishes you as a trusted advisor, as an expert in the industry. I'm going to ask you a question. I like asking this cold, and that
Okay.
is, for the clients that you've served, in terms of, like, just on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1's not important at all, 10 is vital to the overall growth and success of the company, how would you rate content on that scale, and why?
Yep. Um, Well, tying back to some of the things I already said, breaking through the clutter, it's a noisy place out there. And great content is a great way to break through that clutter. So I would say I would rank it like an 8, 9, or 10, something very high on the scale of importance, with the asterisk or the caveat of the right content is that critical. Because what, I think we're going to see in more and more of this happening with, chat GPT and AI and the ability to like mass produce content, these tools that can do that. That to me, that is just noise. That content that's just there for the sake of being content, I put that on like the zero side of the scale. Content that's relevant, that's timely, that resonates with your audience, that ranks a 10. So making sure that you're not just producing content to check a box and say, oh, I put out 500 blogs this year. Well, great. But if no one's reading them and they're not necessarily aligned to your SEO or they're not impacting your business, then like content isn't that helpful. But if even you have some really great content, and it could be only 2 or 3 pieces, but it's driving leads, it's getting the right people in the door, it's helping educate your audience, driving your brand awareness, that I can fully support and would back up as a 10 on the scale.
Yeah, I stole this out of a Forbes, article, and it talked about how content marketing solves problems, but thought leadership actually sparks conversations.
I like that.
Yeah. And, in this day and age where the B2B buyer is going to much more of a self-serve buying process, they're researching more than ever before they ever want to talk to anybody inside the organization, right?
Yep.
So what our goal as marketers is then to get further and further up into the buyer's journey, earlier in the buyer's journey. We're not going to do that with low quality content. We're not
Yep.
going to do that with, typical product marketing content, which is very important. But in terms of sparking a conversation, we're going to have to help. We're going to have to educate. We're going to have to play that role as a trusted advisor, right? That means there's much, much more emphasis on content and on really high quality or thought leadership content. So,
And Steve, I'd love to really quickly jump in with an example of great content that just happened. So recently released on Netflix is the show called House of Usher. And in one of the episodes, one of the characters makes a comment about the brand Edible Arrangements. If anyone listening doesn't know about them, you can probably like find ads in the back of your airline magazine. They're, bouquets of pineapple and food and things like this that one may spend to a client or a B2B, someone in a B2B setting. And so the character comments about how, she's like, you only send edible arrangements to people you hate. And great content was Edible Arrangements jumping on that. They actually sent an edible arrangement to the actress who plays the character in this particular scene. And it has a note around, presumably like a sarcasm kind of intended, like, wow, we love you so much. We wanted to send you an edible arrangement, sort of playing off like a cheeky way of like, obviously they don't hate her, but like playing into that love hate of the edible arrangement. And I think like that probably didn't come up on a marketing plan, but that is great content. And, potentially, like sparking that conversation or resonating with the audience or letting people know what that brand is and getting it into the zeitgeist of the conversation. So whenever I see really interesting ways that brands have brought themselves back and, and got into the conversation, I like to share it. And that just happened here in, the last few days or so.
yeah, it's a really interesting conversation, right? They turned the tables a bit and
Totally.
made it a positive. I love that. So let me ask a last question here, because we could go on for a long time and we've talked about a lot already. But if there was a takeaway, if there was a single thought that you wanted to leave the audience with here from the conversation today, what would that be?
Well, I'm gonna borrow a quote if that's okay. You borrowed one from Forbes, so
I borrowed one. I stole it.
yeah,
Yeah, no doubt.
yeah.
No doubt.
So Bill Gates and other people have said something akin to this, but people overestimate, what they can do in 1 year and they underestimate what they can do in 10 years. And, as we've said, I focus on startup companies. And I think that this particular quote makes so much sense with startups because in with going back to the FOMO of revenue and making sure you understand your clients and doing voice of client interviews, you know, you overestimate how many audiences you can go after in one plan, in one time period. And I think there's such power in niching down because if you understand that and you really focus, maybe you understand that audience and you can go after another in that same year in this case, but like focus and niching down is going to help you do a lot more in the long run. And so that would be my one takeaway, which is don't think of it as, oh, I'm missing out and I'm not going to have as much revenue. If you focus on understanding your audience and getting that revenue and understanding them so deeply that you have all the metrics and the understanding of how to acquire more customers, it will actually allow you to accelerate your business a lot faster.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you for sharing everything that you have today. If there were people that had follow-on conversation questions for you, would it be appropriate to send them a link maybe to your profile on LinkedIn?
Absolutely. And I would say that I post content every week, different marketing tips and tricks and thoughts on the B2B tech marketing space, both on LinkedIn and on YouTube. So if people want to find me in either place, they're more than welcome.
Well, fantastic. Well, again, thank you, Amanda, for coming on and sharing. And I love the idea, just the thought of a different framework for thinking about FOMO in marketing, right? And it's the fear of missing out and therefore not getting actually what you're looking for to begin with. So I love that. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for the opportunity, Steve. It was a good chat.